состоятся переговоры главы российского внешнеполитического ведомства с его коллегой, министром иностранных дел Республики Сербия. Планируется углубленный обмен мнениями по российско-сербским многоплановым отношениям, взаимодействию. Конечно, ситуация в Косово и в целом на Балканах. Ну и стороны, естественно, обменяются мнениями по широкому спектру международных тем. Также 17 февраля министр иностранных дел России Сергей Лавров примет участие в церемонии награждения ведомственными наградами представителей региональных властей, российских общественных деятелей, руководителей территориальных органов МИД России в Екатеринбурге, Казани.
With the states of unfavorable for external conditions for its social and economic development, defending the rights of Russian citizens and compatriots who live abroad. A starting meeting of the G20 foreign policy chiefs within the framework of the first presidency of our friends and associates from South Africa is in the works. And this year it will take place in Johannesburg in South Africa from February the 20th to February the 21st. This is a landmark event not only for Pretoria but also for the entire African continent, which for the first time will be hosting the events related to the G20. The Russian delegation is scheduled to be headed by Minister of Foreign Affairs of our country, Sergei Lavrov. It is expected that the majority of members of this leading economic forum, as well as a wide range of invited states and international organizations, will be represented at a similar level. The debates will open with an address by the President of South Africa, who will set the general tune for the discussion of global challenges and threats, and of course special attention will be paid to the international situation, which is deteriorating under the influence of the confrontational policy of neoliberal Western elites. The parties will address pressing issues of integrity and effective functioning of the global economic system, and the priorities set by South Africans are designed to stimulate economic growth, reduce inequalities and imbalances, ensure equitable access to finance for the countries of the Global South. Such a framework base will be Pretoria's slogan, which it has outlined in support of solidarity, equality and sustainable development. And in doing so, South Africa follows in the footsteps of the chairmanships of its predecessors from the world majority states from 2022 to 2024, Indonesia, India and Brazil. This refers in particular to the G20's significant contribution during this period to strengthening the foundations of a multipolar world and democratizing global economic institutions in the interests of new non-Western centers of influence, especially the newly enlarged BRICS. Key guidelines for the exchanges are the upcoming anniversaries, of course the 80th anniversary of the victory in World War II, the establishment of the United Nations, the 65th anniversary of the adoption by our initiative of the Declaration on Decolonization, which ensured the independence and consolidation of its independence in Africa. The Minister's remark will provide a detailed analysis of the international situation with a focus on the root causes of the events that were observed and are observed now, crises and conflicts, concrete steps will be outlined to overcome destructive phenomena. The Russian side will reaffirm its policy of maintaining the central role of the United Nations in world affairs. As well, once again, we will emphasize the importance of strict observance of the principles of the UN Charter in their interrelation and entirety. We will also emphasize the need that there is no alternative to respectful interstate cooperation, no alternative to providing indivisible and equal security for all. We intend also once again to call for maintaining an open global economy and reject trade wars, illegitimate, illegal, criminal sanctions, and other manifestations of unfair competition. And of course, certain attention will be paid to the problems related to the groups that are building based on honesty without diktat, without blackmail, such as the EAU, the SCU, and the BRICS. And considerable attention will be paid to the matter of the Russian initiative of the Greater Eurasian Partnership. As it usually happens on the sidelines of the G20 meetings, a number of contacts are planned between the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation and his colleagues. Now we will speak about the crisis in Ukraine. The AFU terrorists continue their terrorist activities against the population. In February, as a result of a strike of a drone in Valuski district of the Belgrade region, a man and 2 women died. They had 18 and 14 years. On February the 8th, the Ukrainian armed forces launched an inhuman artillery strike on a densely populated area of Makiivka in Donetsk, the DPR, which had tragic consequences. A woman died. Her young daughter was gravely injured. 10 other people were injured, including 1 child. On February the 10th, the Banderites fired several dozen different munitions and used drones on 26 settlements in Belgrade region. 2 men were wounded, infrastructure and technological equipment were damaged. On the same day, as a result of a deliberate drone attack on the highway Mikhailovka-Vasilievka in Zaporozhye region, two elderly people were injured who traveled with their little grandson. Fortunately, the boy was unscathed. A resident of the liberated town of Novogrodovka, DPR, told journalists about how the AFU militants cynically used him to check for mines. Just imagine, to check for mines in residential premises. A child had, as was intended by the Banderites, to become a human detector of whether it was possible to walk through that territory or whether it was mined. What does it resemble? Only one thing. This is how the Nazis acted in the 20th century. This is how the neo-Nazis act in the 21st century. As Kursk region is being liberated, new atrocities by the Ukrainian Nazis are being uncovered. In a house in the Sudzhan district, a body of a tortured and murdered veteran of the Great Patriotic War was found. He survived the Nazis, but he could not survive the neo-Nazis. And there will be a retribution for all that. We have testimonies from the soldiers of the 83rd Independent Guards Airborne Assault Brigade who liberated at the end of January the village of Nikolayevo-Daryino in the very same Sudzhan district of the Kursk region. Its residents were used by the Ukrainian Nazis as human shields. They were deprived of assistance, were subjected to abuse. In the end, the Ukrainian armed forces monsters killed almost all the men. Only one man miraculously survived, and several other women from the village who were evacuated, as well as him, recounted the details of these horrific events. The world thought that the Belarusian village of Khatyn is the very alarm bells that should prevent people from forgetting how deeply inhuman the population of Earth can become under these nationalistic Nazi slogans. But it turns out these alarm bells, these bells in Khatyn, did not reach everyone. The abuse, the atrocities, the crimes that are being committed against civilians in the Kursk region by neo-Nazis of the Kiev regime is a crime without a term of expiry. It is a true crime committed by the neo-Nazis. It is a crime that on the one side has all the signs of being a genocide on national grounds and based on the signature of those who committed it. And at the same time, they have all the signs of being committed by humans who profess terrorism. But the neo-Nazis will be punished for these and other crimes. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for war crimes. A life sentence in absentia was given to the commander of the 138th Anti-Aircraft Brigade of the Air Command of the AFU, Dieman, on whose order on February 23, 2024, a missile attack was carried out against the farm Trudovaya Armenia in the Krasnodar region. As a result of the terrorist attack, 10 people were killed. To 13.5, 14 and 14.5 years in prison in absentia were sentenced mercenaries from Georgia Tornike Okropyelashvili, Gvanse Gelashvili, and Valikoy Zoria. I would like to note that the flag belonging to the so-called soldiers of flag from Georgia was found by law enforcement agencies in the basement with brutally murdered residents of the Kursk village of Ruskaya Porechnya. We spoke about this crime by the Kiev regime in detail at a briefing on January 31st this year. 13 years and 9 months and 14 years in prison, respectively, received Latvian and Lithuanian so-called legionnaires Zigmars Ronis and Albertas Glazaukas. They fought in the battalions of Carpathian Sich and the Kastus Kalinowski regiment. All the perpetrators were put on international wanted lists. Russian law enforcement agencies continue to work to bring Ukraine Nazis and foreign mercenaries to justice for war crimes and other crimes. And by the way, every time we speak about these crimes, and every time we speak about the punishment that awaits their perpetrators, and we will continue to do so, we can see how these Western leaders rubber stamp decisions to support the Kiev Nazis with money and weapons, how they contribute to crimes against humanity, and they will not escape responsibility for their actions. You can see what are the components of their responsibility. On the 12th of February, a regular meeting of the contact group for defense assistance to Ukraine in the Ramstein format was held in Brussels, and for the first time, instead of the head of the Pentagon, the British defense minister took the chair. Thus, he emphasized his readiness to assume the role of the main director of the West's war against Russia by the hands of the Ukrainians. However, it appears that they have a lot of problems, these Western strategists. This castling should be considered only as an element of a chess combination, as on February the 6th, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Jim Townsend stressed in an interview with Politico, Britain can coordinate aid to Ukraine, but he said there will be no money and thus no aid itself without the United States. There were rumors on the sidelines of Ramstein that its meeting on Wednesday turned out to be the worst for Ukraine. I don't know what is worse, not to supply Kiev with military assistance in the volumes Zelensky insists on, or to supply it. From Western point of view, it is worse, apparently, not to supply this assistance. We are talking about another thing. If somebody in the West has at least a little bit of compassion towards Ukraine as a state, towards Ukrainians as people, as residents of those territories, as citizens of Ukraine, then they should spare them and will not do everything in their power to destroy them all, because it is precisely the aim of Zelensky using this Western money. As part of Ramstein, only the British decided to splurge on aid to Ukraine, promising to allocate $186 million. For the Kiev, who is killing its own citizens, this is a drop in the ocean, because only to hold the front line every month it spends more than $3 billion a month. Simply count.
Just make some calculations. Over 30 billion a year is what Ukraine would need, and how much buildings could be constructed for the citizens of Ukraine, how many schools, how many plants and factories, how much could be invested into new technologies, into the settlement of urgent issues, not only in the field of high-tech, but simply this money could be spent in order to settle the routine problems of Ukraine, how many roads and airports could be constructed. But it's not going to happen. Ukraine is to have a different future, according to the West. The West decided that Ukraine should have a different future. London seeks to have a new leader role, so the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the UK, David Lammy, during his visit to Kiev some days ago, embarrassed himself. He wanted to demonstrate his erudition, but he happened to say that there was a century and then 1,000-year long history of the partnership between the Englishman and the old Ukrainians, as he put it. He is the victim of UK education and probably of UK science too. According to him, 1,000 years ago, according to the British Foreign Minister, Kiev princesses married British princes. It was a quote. I believe that professional historians couldn't believe their eyes. Probably they tried to clarify the origin of this fake information, and when they realized that this statement by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the UK, and I believe that soon the title of the head of the Foreign Office of the UK will sound as a verdict. So the scientists didn't believe their ears, and they found out, in order to recall to the UK Foreign Minister, that 1,000 years ago Ukraine didn't exist as a state. There was an old Russian state called Rus, but it had nothing to do with Ukraine. Indeed, Russian princesses indeed entered dynastic marriages But the issue is, probably someone will inform Mr. Lammy about it. They never married Anglo-Saxons. On the other hand, it might be the case that what Mr. Lammy wanted to say, that all the ancient Ukrainian princesses married. Well, maybe he thought that Americans also existed thousands of years ago. Well, in the chronicles, there are records about an opposite case. In the 11th century, a Russian prince, Vladimir Monomach, married an English princess, Githa of Wessex. Who was she? She was the daughter of King Harold II, killed by Normans during the Battle of Hastings. But what Mr. Lammy was talking about never happened. Of course, we understand that the British do cherish imperial ambitions, and they can speak about things that are non-existent, about things that have no historical evidence, about the histories of cooperation with their vessels, and apparently those vessels are ready to listen to anything. But what we see behind these chronicles is a simple political calculation. He wants to push the Ukrainian regime to continue the hostilities against Russia. But the people in Ukraine have been tortured by the Kiev regime to such an extent. They have been brainwashed by the West to such an extent that probably after they've heard these words by Foreign Minister Mr. Lammy, probably they believed it. Something different that emerged from this same myth production machine. There was a declaration about the first anniversary of the creation of a so-called international coalition to return Ukrainian kids. The coalition between Canada and Ukraine. Well, over the past time, such a great number of empty bodies were launched that did nothing other than rubber-stomping documents and Russophobic statements. So it is surprising how they manage not to confuse these documents. The so-called coalition, according to its founders, contributed to the return of 600 children to Ukraine in 2024. It is something that they claim as evidence. But there are no grounds for no evidence. There is no evidence for these figures. So let's try to find out what is behind these figures. Let me remind you that in Russia there is a clear algorithm that was developed by the special representative of the President for Children's Rights, Madam Lvova Belova, with cooperation with the Ukrainian side and with facilitation of international mediators such as Qatar, Vatican, and International Committee of the Red Cross. As a result, 87 children from 69 families reunited with their relatives in Ukraine in 3 countries, and 15 children from 10 families returned to their families in Russia. So we are not talking about hundreds of children. Why did the Ministries of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and Canada speak about hundreds of children? Even if they were talking about other minors, there have been checks, and it was established that they never separated from their relatives. They entered Russia together with their family members, and in some cases They didn't move anywhere. They are simply considered by the Zelensky regime as deported persons because they live in the territories that reunified with Russia following the referendum in September 2022. It is obvious that these children in these territories no longer have anything to do with Ukraine. But let's get back to this figure of alleged 600 children who have been returned home. Whom are they talking about? Why are they talking about these hundreds of children? I've shared with you the Russian statistics. These statistics are regularly provided by Madam Lvova-Belova. So why are they talking about hundreds of children? I can assume that they are talking about the children who were taken out of their families in European countries, in the countries of the European Union. But let's state it clearly. In August 2024, the National Service of Ukraine reported that it counts 430 such children, and we have grounds to believe that in reality the number of such cases is much greater. That's how you should present these facts. Hundreds of children who've been separated from their families have nothing to do with Russia. They are spread all over the Western countries, NATO countries. We hope that all these children will be indeed returned to their families, but Russia has nothing to do with it. Let Brussels deal with it. Let Brussels report to the international community why and how it so happened that in their territories there are minors who have been separated from their parents. Probably it would be meaningful and reasonable once the Kiev regime and its masters in the West keep referring to the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, probably they should raise this issue about the separated children with the International Criminal Court. And something that alarmed the world. For many years we had been trying to squeeze this international body, the USAID, from Russia, but the facts revealed recently are alarming. There have been publications about the details about the activities of this body. The USAID is an agency that was engaged in, so to say, international development. What is international development? It is facilitation of educational projects, facilitation of economic development, and resolutions of issues related to poverty, famine, and probably something related to security. But what did USAID do in Ukraine? Look at the figures provided by the US Department of State. From 2021 to 2022, the Ukraine track was a priority one for the agency. It accounted for 21% of all of its assistance, worth $30.6 billion US. So let's see where this money went to. The lion's share of entire funds, $24.1 billion US, was aimed at maintaining the so-called macroeconomic stability. It was done in coordination with the World Bank. However, in the context of a growing real deficit, the budget of 40%, only 21% of real needs were covered. So even Kiev regime had questions regarding the efficiency of this assistance. Imagine the US allocated money, sent it to Ukraine, and they did understand that it was not an effective tool to resolve the economic problems. So why did they continue to do so? Why didn't they spend this money for something useful? The answer is simple: it is a corruption scheme. But the agency had enough time and money for different initiatives. The Ukraine information field was free from any alternative points of view. According to WikiLeaks, around 6,200 journalists from 707 media were at the payroll. Imagine, over 6,000 journalists were paid by this agency, by the USAID, as well as 979 NGOs who received similar assistance, financial assistance. Money was provided and allocated to the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, local bodies, and those in charge of persecution of canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in particular the so-called Center for Economic and Political Studies, named after Razumkov, regularly issued sociological studies pointing to the support of the Ukrainian society of the schismatic Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Now it's clear why and how this schism occurred in Ukraine. But in reality, it's not a schism. It is an elimination of orthodoxy in Ukraine. USAID was involved in it in particular. As it turned out, the USAID acted through David Michael Bonn, who even didn't have a legal education in law. And for 15 years he tried to readjust the justice system in Ukraine. Other fraudulent schemes of this body involve pseudo-accounting for the weapons provided to Ukraine, as well as attempts to gain access to the frozen Russian assets. There have been information reports about in the social networks that after the beginning of the special military operation, the USAID sponsored travels of Hollywood stars to Ukraine. It was done in order to draw the attention of the Western audience to the democratic transitions in Ukraine and in order to praise Mr. Zelensky. I'm talking about the propaganda tours by Angelina Jolie, Orlando Bloom, Sean Penn, Ben Stiller, Jean-Claude Van Damme. It all cost Washington $38.5 million US. But remember how it was presented to the audience. According to them, the American public figures inspired by the democratic transitions in Ukraine and sympathetic with the Ukrainian peoples wanted to support it with their tours, with communication and meetings. They tried to present it in a beautiful way. The international world community was witnessing these beautiful reports about fantastic tolerance that all these so-called stars that I have mentioned felt and translated into reality in the face of the atrocities experienced and suffered by the Ukrainian people. They've never seen these atrocities in reality. They didn't want to know that for decades, the Zelensky regime had been killing the people and eliminated the statehood of Ukraine. They persecuted people for their ethnicity. They banned national languages and made attempts to rewrite and revise national history. They couldn't see it. What they saw was the beautiful picture that the USAID paid them to see. You know, the name for those who love for money. Now let's talk about the ongoing funding from the US. According to the media, Ukraine continues to receive money that was approved by the previous US administration of Joe Biden. Mr. Zelensky tries to persuade the Western allies to resume the military supplies, and he stressed that the stop of these deliveries might lead to a situation when Ukraine loses its territories. How can he not understand that he's already lost his country and his people? Why? Because until that time, even early, Zelensky lost his conscience. Let me remind you that in September 2025, throughout Lebanon, there was a massive explosion of pagers, and now we see that Kiev tries to take over the tactics employed by Israel. Tel Aviv admitted that this campaign with the pagers was a planned campaign against Hezbollah. Since that time, our militaries started detecting the facts of deliberate mining of furniture in the houses, in residential houses. Pieces of furniture were mined in the houses that were left over in the villages of Donbass. Explosive devices are incorporated into some pieces of furniture. And there are also recordings that spread familiar noises, such as calls for assistance. These calls are supposed to draw the attention of the people around.
People with compassion will not pass by, but when someone tries to open such a piece of furniture, a closet, for example, or some other device, then there will inevitably be an explosion. There are many cases when such tactics were used by terrorists. Now, the AFU have become to use it on a frequent basis. In the same vein, we receive reports about the delivery of booby-trapped FPV goggles of the Cobra model produced by Skyzone, in which improvised explosive devices with a capacity of 10-15 grams of plastic explosive were found. There is reason to believe that this is the work of the Ukrainian secret services, who use volunteers, with the volunteers none the wider, in order to plant booby-trapped equipment during the purchase of aid for the front. But once again, this emphasizes the terrorist character of the Kiev regime and the AFU and battalions under its control. Also continues the fight against the monuments in Ukraine. On February 5th in Kharkiv, a monument dedicated to Galina Nikitina, who was shot there in February 1942 by the Gestapo, was demolished. The cynical pretext for this action drew attention. It was explained by the monument symbolizing, just think, a repressive regime which tried to destroy Ukrainian national identity and culture. Such false, fake propaganda nonsense is what Nazis precisely have always used to justify their atrocities and cruelty. They have only one identity: hatred, a false sense of being exceptional, and the destruction of everything that does not fit into that concept. All these facts that I've mentioned, all the things that we will talk about today, all this confirms the relevance of the special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine and eliminate threats emanating from its territory. All its objectives, as Russian leadership have repeatedly stated, will definitely be achieved. We can see the moral support from NATO-centric structures to their Ukrainian subordinates. When we talk about NATO-centric structures, we not only speak about members, but also about all those who spread and propagate this destructive logic of the NATO. The correspondent of the ABC, with a beautiful name of the movie Fortitude, was shown in prime time on February the 10th this year, and this movie, The Fortitude, was dedicated to the special military operation in Ukraine. I would like to note that this is an ugly brainchild of Australian documentary journalism, although the journalism there died after such a fake story was ascribed to it. All this is evidence of the level to which ABC propaganda journalism has stooped to. Correspondent Willis was reporting from an AFU bunker, and he invited the viewers to watch in great detail the remote killing of a Russian soldier by kamikaze drones. These words, spoken, such as "kill Russians," were repeatedly, obsessively mentioned throughout the movie, sometimes accompanied by mocking laughter. Where did we hear it? George Bush, the senior, spoke about it in a broadcast when he said, thinking that he spoke to representatives of the Kiev regime, he said that it was the purpose of modern Ukraine to kill as many Russians as possible. The ABC is well known for relentlessly brainwashing its audience, demonizing Russia, and glossing in every possible way over the responsibility of the West and its Kiev puppets for the crimes in Ukraine. Let's call things by their proper names. This media outlet in Australia openly promotes ethnic hatred and spreads blatant lies. Naturally, prejudiced hostility from the Australian media mainstream against Russia is nothing new, but the ABC has brought it to the point of true Russophobia and true Nazism. Even though only a few days ago the Australian Federal Parliament passed a law toughening penalties for crimes motivated by national hatred. Or is national hatred also segregated? Are the nationalities against which one cannot show hatred? But from the point of view of the officials in Australia, it seems that they are nationalities that should actually evoke hatred. Again, in terms of our people, we see that the Australian media are spreading this hatred. Another couple of words about USAID. This is a fantastic story. I believe books will be written and selections or even documentaries will be published, as well as reports, and full-scale movies will be created about the topic of how, for years, this organization, USAID, lied to people and for money bought people who became conductors of lies, falsehoods, disinformation, and obviously committed crimes against conscience. Now we have been speaking about the actions of the USAID in Ukraine, its propaganda, its acquisition, bribing of people and journalists. It paid media, NGOs, and governmental structures, made judicial reforms. Perhaps this is not the most horrific act that the USAID has committed. I will now cite a number of examples that can be discussed in separate. In terms of horrific criminality, we are talking about military biological activities of the US outside of their territories. It was carried out under the guise of developing national systems of sanitary and epidemiological surveillance and countering threats of biological terrorism in different countries. Such dangerous activity, as you know, was being carried out in many countries of the world, including some states of the former Soviet Union, and a blatant example of the above-mentioned activities of the United States were the cases uncovered as a result of the special military operation of the implementation in violation of the Convention on the Prohibition of Biological and Toxic Weapons of the Pentagon's biological military programs on Ukrainian territory. We have spoken about it. The Minister of Defense of Russia spoke about it. Brilliantly, this topic was covered and expounded on by the Chief of the Radiological, Chemical and Biological Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, who fell victim to a terrorist attack. A fundamental contribution to exposing the unlawful actions of the United States was made by the Parliamentary Commission for investigating the circumstances surrounding the establishment by United States specialists of biological laboratories on the territory of Ukraine. Its work resulted in the publication of a detailed report prepared on the basis of the full range of available sources, including documents seized during the special military operations, results of interviews with numerous witnesses who had information about the activities of the Pentagon and related institutes in the Ukrainian biolaboratories. The above-mentioned documents indicate in particular the involvement, once again, of the United States Agency for Allegedly International Development, USAID, in the implementation of U.S. military biological activities. USAID programs were used to finance in-depth studies in Ukraine of antibiotic-resistant forms of tuberculosis. It cannot even be imagined. We are talking about an agency that was supposed, in accordance to its mandate, to send money for international development. But as part of the aforementioned studies, a protocol was created for research on resistance to anti-tuberculosis medicine. At the same time, work was carried out to identify new possible routes. You cannot believe it, but we have to believe it because it was proved by documents. New possible routes of infection with a highly resistant strain of tuberculosis. So this is a diversion. These diversive activities were carried out by the USAID in Ukraine. To clarify all aspects of U.S. biological military activity in Ukraine, Russia applies diverse efforts in the international arena. We initiated a consultative meeting on Article 5 of the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention. I would like to recall that it happened in September 2022 in Geneva, and also it was discussed on October 27th and November 2nd, 2022 in the UNSC and during the 9th Review Conference of the BTWC in December 2022. What do you think we heard in response? In response to our recent questions on the matter from the US, we heard nothing. We only saw how they tried to accuse us of misinformation and propaganda. Nothing substantial, as they are prone to say. Nothing corroborated by facts was heard. And what happens nowadays? Today, the US authorities themselves admit that Russian statements about the danger of US military and biological activities have turned out to be true. The recent comment from Washington about the involvement of the USAID in financing the development of biological weapons only confirms the validity of our claims in connection with US biological military activities in close proximity to Russian territories. We hope that this information will allow us to get from the US, and I would like to recall that they are one of the depositories of the BTWC, appropriate answers to the questions we have raised, and will allow to resolve this unsightly situation and ensure that Washington complies with its obligations under the Convention. The things that American officials and public figures are concealing horrifies the very same people of America. This is the point of truth. This is the truth that the Americans are learning now about themselves, what they have been involved in by the neoliberal regimes, why taxes were collected and where they were allocated to, how destructive and mocking of their own principles and slogans was carried out under the guise of defending human rights, the new normal, tolerance, and democracy. Another example, Slovakia. Prime Minister Fico has more than once publicly spoken about direct interference from external forces in the internal political life of the country in an attempt to overthrow the current coalition government. Why? In his words, the West does not want to accept the sovereign policy of Slovakia, including when it comes to its attitude towards the situation in Ukraine and its relations with Russia. From Slovak media, we know that Robert Fico bases his statements on data received from the local intelligence services. Bratislava is seriously concerned about the degree of foreign intrusion and influence on internal processes in the country. Inter alia, I guess, through USAID in 2018, the Slovak Ministry of Foreign Affairs signed a memorandum of understanding with the agency, and in 2022 the document was extended for a new 3-year term. Robert Fico published in this regard an open letter. He addressed it to the new US administration, where he welcomed the decision to terminate the activities of the agency, whose resources, quote, were among other things used for political gain in Slovakia, in order to deform the political system and support certain political parties. Subsidies, grants, worth several $million, according to the Slovak Prime Minister, were provided to NGOs, media outlets, and individual journalists working in Slovakia, not based on equal access, but rather based on the political conjunctive, segregation, and selectivity. Currently, Slovak law enforcement authorities are looking into the matter. As it turns out, the former Slovak government also provided direct financial support to Georgian NGOs as well. It is possible Bratislava suggests that it was the funds intended for the implementation of USAID so-called humanitarian projects that were used in the organization of the recent mass anti-government riots that had swept across Slovakia. But that is not all. It seems this will be a separate section of our briefing. A new one, USAID. Look what happened in Albania. Recently, we saw figures that show how much the agency spent on the maintenance of its agents of influence in the Balkan states. In particular, I would like to emphasize, these are not figures invented by Russian hackers. These are not anonymous materials. These are official statistics that were published officially on Albania. Only in the last 4 years alone, almost $200 million US dollars has been spent to create a pro-American layer in Tirana in state and public institutes. Relevant data. Who was it made public for? By Richard Grenell, U.S. Special Envoy for the Organization of Diplomatic Institutions. For the Western Balkans alone, almost $2 billion was spent. Once again, this information was published by Richard Grenell, the very same Grenell who was U.S. ambassador in Germany. Horrendous corruption schemes are being uncovered where Albania was relegated by the agency to the role of some kind of a laundering haven for very large sums of money that were going through the USAID. Local investigative journalists, having studied the published data, have come to the conclusion that funds intended on paper for humanitarian projects were transferred through a number of front persons to the institutes of WHO, of George Soros, and other NGOs. Some of the money, judging by the documents, went directly to the state authorities, including the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the courts of Albania. Most strikingly, truly surprises us, but it was also paid directly to the Anti-Corruption Agency of Albania so that it would not investigate the millions of dollars that flowed through the unscrupulous hands of overseas grantors. How do you believe after this a regime in a country will formulate its position? Of course, they will formulate it on Ukraine, for example, not based on reality and facts and interests of their own people. They will formulate the position of their country guided by the interest of those who provide them with those millions. And those who provide them with those millions, for example, USAID, together with the money put into the envelopes, methodic books that are to be used by those regimes. This is why they are being copy-pasted all over NATO countries. This is why they are used by media outlets, journalists, NGOs, because all those people were paid. On the one side, a text was printed in support of the Ukrainian regime, but on the other side, a US dollar was attached. It all went through the USAID. All of this has come to light in the last week, but there is no doubt that similar schemes, which have nothing to do with legality, support for democracy, or humanitarian work, have been practiced in many countries and regions of the world for decades. And this is the money of American taxpayers, and these American taxpayers had no idea what their taxes were being spent on.
Look how they treat military pensioners in the Baltic states. It was on several occasions that we touched upon this topic, and we continue to take active efforts in order to unblock the crisis situation created by the Baltic authorities in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The principled position of our country was presented to the foreign policy agencies of the Baltic states in our contacts with the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We handed over the notes in which we committed our adherence to the international obligations under intergovernmental treaties with Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn about social guarantees and protections for military pensioners. We stress that it is Baltic authorities that are responsible for this artificial crisis. In particular, the Swedbank refuses to accept payments from the Russian banks who are under illegitimate sanctions. The Russian diplomatic missions in the three countries meet military pensioners in these countries, explain the true reasons for the problems with the financing, and we'll continue to do our utmost to make sure that this crisis is resolved as soon as possible. Talking about the Russophobia in some other countries, in particular, I'm going to talk about President of Italy. During his presentation in the Marshall University, a President of the Italian Republic made some insulting statements about our country. He drew outrageous and bluntly false historical parallels between the Russian Federation and the Nazi Germany, who called to take into account the failure of the Western policy aimed at appeasing the aggressor in the late 30s. When settling the Ukraine crisis, he said that Russian activities allegedly had a similar nature with the project of the Third Reich in Europe. It is striking to see such blasphemous statements from the President of Italy, a country that knows firsthand what fascism really is. Only they have a different history, different lessons than we have. Our country was subjected to and attacked by the Hitler Germany, but our country not only managed to squeeze the enemy out from our territory, but also accompanied it to its home country, and we liberated Europe from fascism and Nazism, and we assisted European countries in restoring their territories, although our country was the one that needed the assistance. The Mussolini regime was a true ally of the Nazi Germany under the still anti-Comintern and the Berlin Pacts. It provided to the Third Reich 235,000 troops for the expeditionary force in order to conduct aggression against the USSR. Did President of Italy forget his history? I don't think so. Back in 1941 was when it all happened. The then regime in Italy bears joint responsibility with the Hitler regime for the genocide against the Soviet people during the Great Patriotic War. President of Italy should remember that today Italy, together with other NATO countries, pumps the terrorist neo-Nazi Kiev regime with modern lethal weapons and supports the criminal neo-Nazi regime in all its crimes. The Zelensky regime is founded on the same hatred ideas, although they are formulated and implemented in a different way thanks to the NATO assistance. But the essence is the same: a segregation of people based on their ethnicity, their religion, their language, their culture, respect for their traditions and history. Same was promoted by Hitler and his accomplices in all forms and manifestations, be it his allies on the state level or simply collaborators. But we know a different Italy. We know Italians who during World War II organized strong partisan movements and actively participated in these partisan movements. Thousands of Soviet people were partisans too. I'm talking about prisoners of war and deported civilians who fought together with their Italian compatriots against fascism and gave their lives in order to liberate Italy and their motherland. By various estimates, out of 12,000 of foreign participants of the Italian resistance movement, about half were Soviet citizens. Did Mr. President mention it? 13 heroes were awarded Italian state awards. It is shameful not to know an own history. Statements by Mr. Mattarella not only insult their memory, but also the memory of all Italian anti-fascists, their ancestors in Russia, their descendants in Russia and in Italy, and all those who know it find these analogies unacceptable. But I know that, to put it mildly, not all in Italy do share such odious assessments. On the 4th of February, in Rizon, the city authorities, together with the Consulate General of Russia in Genoa, held a 5th international conference entitled Peoples of the USSR and European Countries in the Fight Against Neo-Fascism during World War II. The event brought together Italian representatives who know the real history, not only those who cherish it but are ready to uphold the historical truth. Russia and Italy cherish the memory of Soviet and Italian heroes, partisans who gave their lives in fight against Nazism and fascism and all the crimes of the 20th century. Well, Russophobia is a